Hello and welcome to this quick take video, the introduction to 2014 Xilinx licensing changes, and also we're going to talk about activation licensing. My name is Ray Martin and I am the product manager for licensing among some other things here at Xilinx. Today, what are we going to learn today? Well, we're going to learn about what has changed in 2014 Xilinx tools licensing. So mainly Vivado licensing and mainly tools licensing as opposed to IP licensing, which basically has stayed the same for the time being. We're also going to talk about the background activation, why we're doing it, some of the other things around activation, about how it works and some of the background there. Also, process for generating a client node-locked activation license, and finally the process for returning activation license back to Xilinx. The agenda today, we'll talk about Xilinx licensing changes for 2014, why are we using activation, transition to activation licensing, the client node lock license creation, and finally activation license returns. In Vivado 2014.1, there are three main changes to licensing that we've made. The first is ISE and Vivado are now separate entitlements. Back in 2013.1, we split up the installers for ISE and Vivado, but in 2013, the licensing was still a single license file, and it had the components in it for both ISE and Vivado. In 2014.1, we have followed suit with the installers, and now we are splitting up the licenses for ISE and Vivado. So now if you purchase Vivado in 2014.1 and later, you'll see two entitlements that are added to your account, much like shown in the picture here to the right. The first is your ISE license, which is now containing just ISE components and is the traditional license file or .lic style certificate-based license that we've always kind of had with ISE. ISE is not changing its licensing style. For Vivado, new licenses purchased after 2014.1 launched are now activation-based licenses. And these will show up here in the lower section of the Xilinx product licensing website. You can also see that when you purchase Vivado, you get a corresponding ISE license to your Vivado Edition license. So if you purchase Vivado Design Edition, you'll get both a Vivado Design Edition license as well as an ISE Embedded Edition license, which is equivalent to Design Edition as far as capabilities go. For Vivado System Edition, you'll get a System Edition of both. Also in 2014.1, Xilinx introduces activation-based licensing for Vivado. This is an add-on to Flexera's .lic file-based licensing or certificate-based licensing in the past, where basically the container for the license was a .lic file, and the license itself was locked to one host ID of the machine, whether it be a Ethernet MAC ID or a hard drive serial number. That is what the mechanisms were in the .lic style or certificate style licensing. In activation, a tamper-resistant container and a tamper-resistant locking mechanism are introduced. So the container is actually an area of the hard drive which is called trusted storage, and the locking mechanism is actually a series of host IDs now weighted against each other, not just a single ID or a single point of failure or a single point of tampering. Finally, in 2014.1, the Software Development Kit, SDK, is once again licensed. Now, SDK was made free and licensing was removed in ISE 14.1. SDK is now still free, but licensing is now required from 2014.1 and later. So why activation? Well, activation has some major security improvements. As we've already mentioned, there's a tamper-resistant container and a tamper-resistant locking mechanism. And that tamper-resistant locking mechanism actually provides some more resilience with system changes. So in the past, with a certificate-based license file, you were locking to a single ID. So maybe it's a hard disk serial number or an Ethernet MAC ID. If those change, if the serial number changed or if the MAC ID changed, or maybe you got a whole new motherboard or you were undocking or you got a new wireless adapter, a number of reasons why things could change like a MAC ID, etc., then your license was invalidated because it was locked to that single point. However, now in activation, it's locked to multiple different identifiers across your machine. So now even if one of those changes, or even in some cases we've seen a whole motherboard changes where the hard drive is still the same and some other configuration aspects of the machine are still the same, the license is still recognized as good because we're no longer dependent upon a single ID. Also, there's ease of use enhancements that are coming. Some are actually already available in 2014.1. For example, we have verified returns to Xilinx. This means that we no longer have to do rehost limits or affidavit of destruction for activation. You simply need to return the license to Xilinx using one of the Xilinx utilities, and we'll have an example of that a little bit later on in this presentation. And then one-step node-locked activation. In 2014.3, you'll be able to, with a single click on the Xilinx licensing website, download and install automatically your license. No more having to deal with email and XML files coming over email or even .lic files, etc. This all is handled now by the Vivado License Manager client. And finally, borrowing from floating servers. This is coming in 2015.1. This will be a big enhancement for those who may be using dongles today for working at home or working in remote areas for a period of time. Now you'll be able to actually go ahead and take advantage of a floating license, and when you need to, you can then borrow from that floating license for a period of time. It will automatically time out after that 30 days or 60 days or whatever request you make for it, and then return it to the pool for the rest of the users to use. So no longer do you have to purchase a mix of node locked and floating licenses to be able to have this kind of behavior. Now you can have it all with your floating license and the borrow feature. So a question we often get is, when will I have to transition to activation-based licenses? So for purchase tools, if you're currently in warranty, in other words, your one-year subscription is still in force, then the license files, the .lic files, or certificate-based licenses that you had previously will continue to work for the current tool set. Once your subscription expires, you'll need to purchase a new subscription to use the newer releases of the tools, and that newer subscription will contain activation-based licenses for the Vivado tools. Free tools, we began to switch over to activation in 2014.1. So Vivado Webpack, SDK Standalone, Vivado Evaluation, and Vivado HLS Evaluation licenses, they've all switched over to activation-based licenses beginning in 2014.1. ISE Webpack remains certificate-based. And finally, IP. IP is going to remain in certificate-based licenses throughout the Vivado 2014 release cycle. And warranty-based migration for IP licenses, similar to the warranty-based migration for tools that we did in 2014.1, is planned to begin in 2015.1 for IP. So how does activation-based licensing work? Well, activation licensing is based upon a license repository, that secure container that we were talking about earlier called trusted storage. And because of that, all activation licensing tasks actually pass through trusted storage on their way to the website. So no longer can you just go to the website by entering the URL directly from your browser. You actually need to create a request in the trusted storage, and that trusted storage then outputs a URL for you to use. And so three main tasks here for generating a license. The trusted storage role in this is that Xilinx utility creates a new request in the trusted storage area, and coming out of trusted storage then is a URL that you then want to take into your browser, select your license, and generate it. From there, an XML file gets returned back, which we'll use in the install remove license step in a minute. Return license, same kind of thing, where Xilinx utility creates a return license request into trusted storage. Here, the license that you're currently using and wanting to return to Xilinx is disabled, and the output then is the website URL, which you take into your browser, and the return license at that point is credited back into your license account. An XML file is also created. So out of both of those first two steps, the install remove license step takes that XML file that was created in either one of those two steps and processes it into trusted storage. In the case of generating a license, it marks the request from generating as finished, as well as the one from return license. And so the follow-on action there is the license is now ready for use in a generate case. In a return case, the license has now been removed out of trusted storage, and now you're free to generate new licenses or rehost it to another machine. Also new in Xilinx for 2014 are utilities that deal with the activation licensing. First is Vivado License Manager. That is for node-locked clients, and it's a GUI. Equivalent to that is Xlinks Client Manager, and that's a command line license mainly for using activation licenses, whereas Vivado License Manager, the GUI, will work for both activation and node-locked licenses. It will help you debug your setup there for either one. For floating servers, the utility you need to use to generate requests is Xlinks Server Manager. So if you're working with floating licenses and you come to the Xilinx website from Vivado License Manager, that won't be sufficient. And we'll cover that in more detail in the second presentation on floating licenses. So let's talk about creating a node-locked activation license. also referred to as a client activation license. And the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that trusted storage has been initialized on the machine. Now, typically this will be done by Vivado installer. So automatically, when you install Vivado, it will try to go ahead and initialize trusted storage on client machines. Now, if for some reason this is a remote installation, or for some other reason that the installer hasn't run and has not been able to create trusted storage, then you need to run the install anchor service on Windows, or the install FNP shell on Linux, and you need administrative or root access for all of these, whether it be using our installer or these two utilities. Root access is required, or sudo on Linux, in order for these to be able to create the trusted storage area necessary to act as the repository for the licenses. Step 2 in creation of a node-locked activation license is to create the license request from trusted storage. So in the past, with certificate-based licenses, you've been able to go directly to the licensing website by opening a browser and typing in www.xilinx.com/getlicense. That is no longer applicable, and that's why the X is through that example in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. Instead, you need to use one of the clients that we talked about, either Vivado License Manager or Xlink Client Manager, and make the request through trusted storage. As we mentioned before, the output of that request from Vivado License Manager is going to be a URL that then will be automatically fed to the browser if you are connected to an internet-enabled machine, or it will be written out into an HTML file. You can choose to do so and then take it to a machine later that has internet access and read that HTML file into the browser. It will automatically take you to the Xilinx licensing website. So step 3 is to create your license on the Xilinx product licensing site, and you do that by something very similar to what you're used to before. You log in, and then you go down on the license create license page to the activation-based licenses section. So this is a lower section. You can see certificate-based licenses are at the top. This is at the bottom of the page. Scroll down to that, and you click the Activate License button once you selected which one you want. Then the activation fulfillment record, after you go through a couple of confirmation steps, is created and emailed to you. Now, what if you see what's on the bottom here, where the activation-based license section is grayed out, and you see this important information warning above the section? Basically, there's a couple different causes for this. Number one would be that necessary information wasn't passed in the URL. In other words, you didn't come through Vivado License Manager or the Xlink Client Manager command line utility. The URL must be generated by the Xilinx licensing utility there. The other potential cause is that the request ID has already been used to successfully generate a license. Now, one of two things here: either somebody else from that same machine came in and generated it at the same time. That's highly unlikely, but it could be possible for multiple users of a single machine who are doing a node locked or client license to be able to do that. But more commonly, what you're going to see is that you've already generated a license here. You've come back in to the Xilinx licensing site, but you have not yet gone to your machine and processed that XML file into trusted storage that we'll talk about here in step 4. Or actually step 5, because in step 4 you need to go to your email client and extract out the XML file that came in the license email from Xilinx's licensing site. Now check your junk mail directory, because sometimes they end up going there, and you need to take that XML file, save it to a temporary directory. And this XML file is not actually the license itself, it's a record that will be used to turn on or activate your license in trusted storage. And then step 5, you'll actually load that XML file, load that license record into trusted storage. So you need to run Vivado License Manager, select Load License, and then Activate License. You can then browse to and select the XML file, and it will authorize your machine's trusted storage. And then you're finished. Your machine is now licensed, activated for Xilinx's tools. Now I want to show you something new that's coming in Vivado 2014.3 that basically eliminates steps 4 and step 5, the whole getting an email, saving off the attachment to an XML file, then loading that attachment into trusted storage via running Vivado License Manager and doing the load license and all that. Vivado License Manager in 2014.3 will actually be able to stay resident and will be looking for the XML file to come down from the Xilinx licensing website. So here's the example. I go to next, and then next again on the confirmation screen. So I finished generating my license and I get the confirmation that it has now been generated. Now I'm going to switch back to Vivado License Manager, and you can see here that Vivado License Manager is looking and waiting for the XML file to come down. And as soon as it comes down, it's going to process it into the trusted storage automatically. And you can see now that I just got the email, but I can now ignore that email because if I go to the View License Status page, it's already there. So my license now has automatically been installed for me. So no more emails, no more saving things off, no more loading stuff. If you're running Vivado License Manager, it will automatically go up to the web and find the license that you just generated and automatically insert it for you into trusted storage. As mentioned earlier, returns and rehosts are also easy. So we have a one-step activation license returns that actually has been in the tool since 2014.1. And if you have internet access, you can simply go to the Return License to Xilinx screen and then select from the table up above the license entitlement that you want to return to Xilinx. Now in 2014.3, we're going to enhance this by actually having the increment name up there in the table along with the entitlement ID. But regardless, you can always select the different entitlement IDs, look and see which license it is. That will tell you which license you're about to return to Xilinx. You simply select the entitlement ID, hit return, and then that license is automatically returned to Xilinx and credited back into your entitlement account. And then for rehosting, now we should need fewer rehosts because of the more robust nature of the identification scheme in activation. But if you do need to rehost for whatever reason, maybe you want to move a license from one machine to another, you would basically just return the license and then generate a new license for that new host as if it were brand new. So in summary, there are three major changes for licensing in Vivado 2014. The first is that each Vivado edition purchase now has two license entitlements, one certificate-based license for ISE and one activation-based license for Vivado. SDK has also become licensed again, and finally activation license has been introduced for the Vivado licensing flow. All activation license activity must be initiated from a Xilinx license utility, Vivado License Manager for this example here of node lock licenses. For server-based licenses, you need to use the command line utility, and we'll talk more about that in the next presentation. Generating licenses for activation is similar to certificate licenses with one main difference, and that is that you must enter the Xilinx licensing site from a Xilinx utility, not directly. Also, you get back an XML file instead of a license file. But in 2014.3, we have one-step licensing where you won't have to worry about the file you get back at all. We'll automatically get it and load it into trusted storage for you. So for additional information, there are some related videos, mainly the Vivado 2014 floating activation licensing. In that video, we're going to go into more detail on how to create a server-based or a floating license, and then how to serve that on your license server using LMGRD and some of the utilities that you may be familiar with from the certificate-based licensing flow. For user guides, User Guide 973, the Vivado Design Suite User Guide Release Notes, Installation and Licensing Guide, that has in it a whole chapter on licensing with big sections on activation. And finally, there's a licensing frequently asked questions, or FAQ, and there's the URL for that, and that will take you to a place where there's a number of different questions and answers there, and has been updated for activation as well. Thank you very much for listening.